The wind in Red Bluff didn't blow it scraped. It dragged the dust across cracked boards and sunburnt faces like a whetstone, dry and sharp and mean. The town square stank of spilled whiskey, old sweat, and cruelty gone stale. Around the makeshift platform, no more than 3 warped planks nailed to old Kratisa crowd of miners, drifters, and broken men jeered and jostled each other, jugs swinging from their belts, silver coins sweating in their palms. And at the center of it all stood the girl. She couldn't have been older than 17, if that, barefoot. Her kimono, once a rich indigo, hung off one shoulder in rags, caked in dust, torn across the hem. Her arms were tied behind her back with coarse rope that had already cut into her skin. Her face bore the faintest trace of a bruise beneath one eye, faded, but not forgotten. Her black hair, once brushed smooth, now clung to her cheeks in sweaty strands. But it was her eyes that told the real story. Vacant, dulled, looking somewhere far beyond this moment. Not the eyes of someone hoping to be rescued. The auctioneer, a wiry man with a stovepipe hat and teeth like broken piano keys, clapped his hands and barked like a carnival huckster. Now here's a rare piece, gentlemen. Imported, exotic, quiet as a mouse, and twice as obedient. Straight off the rails, fresh from that port in Frisco. Doesn't speak a lick of English X to say yes. He laughed, ugly and loud. Well, mostly yes. The crowd roared. Startin' at 50 cents, half a dollar for this little lotus flower. Ain't she somethin'? Look at that skin like porcelain. You break her, you bought her. More laughter. The girl didn't flinch, didn't cry. Just kept staring, her mouth pressed into a thin, unreadable line. A man in a tobacco-stained vest raised his hand. 50, he shouted. Put her in my kitchen. 60, yelled another. She'll fetch tips just standin' still. A third offered 75, licking his lips like he was ordering a steak. At the edge of the square, leaning against the hitching post, stood a man who hadn't spoken a word. Wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face, duster coat stiff with trail dust, boots planted like roots in dry earth. A long scar ran along his neck like a memory that refused to fade. His name was Harlan Gage. Folks didn't say it loud, not if they wanted peace. He'd lived just far enough from town to be left alone, and close enough that no one forgot he was there. His eyes, pale and steady, didn't blink as he watched the scene unfold. He saw the girl, saw the cut on her lip, saw how she gripped the wooden platform with her toes like she was trying to hold on to something, anything. The bidding reached $1. Someone cheered like they'd won a prize. But Harlan didn't cheer, didn't move. He just watched. And when the girl, for the briefest moment, turned her head and looked across the crowd past the sweat, past the whiskey breath and leering Aisher gaze landed on him. Only him. She didn't know why. But she didn't look away. The auctioneer's voice scraped the air like a rusted saw. Come on, boys. Don't be shy now, where's that frontier spirit? He waved his hat like a conductor urging an orchestra of drunks. We're talking about a full-blooded exotic, a real find, ain't no mail-order bride ever looked this fine. The laughter swelled, loud and hollow, silver clinked, boots shuffled. A woman, no, a girl stood motionless on that crate, like an object on display in a trader's window. Her rope-bitten wrists shifted once. A breeze tugged at the torn sleeve of her kimono, exposing more of her bruised collarbone. She didn't adjust it, she didn't dare. A shout rang out from the crowd. 150. I'll teach her to clean my boots and warm my bed. The girl blinked slowly, but her eyes were still empty. That's when he moved. No one saw Harlan Gage coming. 1 minute he was part of the dust and distance, another shadow leaning against the post. The next, he was stepping through the crowd, boots striking the packed earth with slow, even weight. He didn't look at anyone. Just walked, cutting through the crush of gamblers and outlaws as if they were mist. The murmurs started then, heads turned, eyes narrowed. Some stepped back not out of respect, but out of knowing. Harlan Gage was not the kind of man you bid against, not unless you were fond of bleeding. He stopped a few feet from the platform, just far enough to not seem threatening, just close enough to freeze the auctioneer's grin mid-sentence. A hush fell like dust over the square. Harlan reached into the breast pocket of his coat and slowly pulled out a single silver dollar. He held it between two fingers, letting the sunlight catch it. Then he raised one calloused hand high, deliberate hand, offered it. No words. Just the coin. A beat passed. Then two. And then the laughter came. It came from the left first, then spread across the crowd like a brush fire. $1? Someone howled. What is Shea Chicken? You gone mad, Gage? Maybe he's gone soft, another barked. He want a house pet or a wife? The auctioneer tried to laugh along, but it came out choked. He cleared his throat. Mr. Gage, you serious? $1? That's. The look Harlan gave him silenced whatever came next. It wasn't threatening, it wasn't violent, but it was final. That coin stayed lifted in the air. His hand didn't shake. He didn't flinch when someone from the back called out, "You gonna save every lost girl that stumbles into town?" The Japanese girl raised her chin a fraction. She looked down at the coin, then at the man. Something flickered in her eyes, a shift barely visible but profound. Confusion first, then something deeper. Something dangerously close to hope. She didn't understand what was happening. He hadn't said a word. But she understood him. He looked at her, and only her. And then Harlan Gage nodded once. That one motion, gentle as it was, struck harder than a gunshot. No pity, no claim, just a vow. In that single, silent nod, something passed between them that the rest of the town would never comprehend. A girl, once priced like livestock, had just been given back the one thing no man there thought she deserved. Dignity. The laughter hadn't fully died when another voice cracked through the tension like a whip. $2, slurred the man from the left side of the square, swaying as he pushed off a whiskey barrel. His boots were too polished for a drifter, and the gold watch chain across his belly strained against his sweat-stained vest. His name was Burke Traversa, foreman for the Western Pacific rail camps out by Bitter Ridge. Everyone knew him for his bad temper and worse habits. He staggered forward, waving two grimy bills in the air. "I'll take her for the crew. Boys get lonely. This one'll keep 'em quiet for a while." A few hoots and ugly cheers followed. The girl flinched. It was the first motion she'd made since stepping on that stage. Harlan didn't move. His dollar still glinted in the dust, his hand still raised, unmoved by the theatrics. He didn't look at Travers, didn't look at the crowd. His eyes stayed on her. The auctioneer, emboldened by the bid, clapped his hands and gave a rat-like grin. "Now we got some spirit. $2, any takers for 3? Someone shouted 3 from the back, then 4. The numbers started climbing, fueled by liquor and spectacle. It wasn't about the girl anymore, it was about besting each other, proving who had more silver to throw at something fragile. But then the crowd split like a tide. Bootsteps rang out measured, sharp, like teeth clicking shut. Victor Kane walked into the square with the kind of presence that made men straighten their backs and quiet their mouths. Tall, lean, dressed in a black pinstripe suit far too fine for Dead Bluff. His boots gleamed. A blood-red silk cravat coiled around his throat like a snake. A gold tooth flashed when he smiled, though the smile never reached his eyes. Those stayed cold, pale, dead as river ice. 10, he said. No slur, no shout, just a low, conversational tone that cut deeper than any holler. The crowd stilled. The auctioneer's face went blank, then pale. "Mr. Kane." Victor held up a gloved hand. "No need for introductions. I think everyone here knows who I am." Everyone did. Victor Kane owned half the mineral rights in 3 counties. He dressed like a banker, moved like a gunslinger, and talked like the devil reading scripture. They said he'd turned whole families into ghost stories over land disputes. Others whispered about what he did with the girls who vanished from the camps. The law stayed quiet. The graves didn't. The Japanese girl looked at him and, for the first time, fear broke through her stoicism. Her breath caught, and her knees wobbled, barely perceptible. Victor saw it, and smiled wider. $10, he repeated, eyes never leaving her. I'll take her. Harlan finally moved, just his jaw tightening. His gaze narrowed, but he didn't speak. The girl was trembling now. Her lips parted as if trying to say something, but nothing came. Not yet. But her body knew something her voice could not. This man was not just another buyer. He was a ghost from another life. Victor's gold tooth glinted again as he turned slightly, addressing the crowd like a showman. Most of you don't know this, he said smoothly, but this little Blossom's daddy once worked for me. Ran the rails out of Yokohama. That is, until he decided his precious honor was more important than my money. He let that hang for a beat, then turned back to her. Guess who gets the last word now? Aiko's knees gave out. She dropped to the platform like a puppet with cut strings. Harlan stepped forward, still silent, but his shadow stretched long over the wood. The war wasn't over a girl. It was revenge. And it had just found its battleground. Aiko knelt where she had collapsed, her bare knees pressing into the cracked wood of the platform. Dust clung to her skin, and her breath came in short, sharp pulls as the bidding escalated around her like a storm she couldn't escape. Numbers volleyed back and forth 12, then 15. The men shouted them like insults, each offer a blow to what little remained of her sense of self. But Victor Kane didn't shout. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his hands folded behind his back like a patient executioner, smiling that same cold, knowing smile. His pale eyes never left her. Every bid from the other men was just noise. He knew they'd all back down. No one crossed him. Not if they wanted to keep breathing. Aiko could feel her heartbeat in her throat, her fingers clenched behind her back, rope biting into her wrists. She dared a glance toward the man in the long coat, silent one, the only one who hadn't treated her like a thing. He was still there. Still watching. She didn't understand why. Then he moved again. No flourish, no swagger, just purpose. The crowd fell quiet as he stepped forward, the coins in his palm glinting in the sun. He reached the crate where the auctioneer stood, wringing his hands, and laid down 2 gold coins with a soft metallic chime that echoed like a bell in a church that hadn't been prayed in for years. No words. Just gold. And a silence that thundered louder than any shout. Victor's smirk vanished, his jaw clenched. You making a mistake, Gage, he said, voice low but charged with venom. She's mine. Harlan didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge the threat. He kept his eyes on the girl. The auctioneer hesitated, sweat dripping down the sides of his face as if he were standing in judgment. He looked from the coins to Victor, then to Harlan, then back again. His voice cracked as he finally spoke. Sold. The crowd exhaled all at once, some in surprise, others in disappointment. No one cheered this time. The tension that had built like storm clouds hadn't broken, it just settled deeper, like a warning. Victor didn't move, but his eyes promised something that would come later, something with blood. Harlan stepped forward, toward the platform. His boots creaked against the wood. Aiko looked up at him, chest heaving, eyes still wild with disbelief. And then, perhaps out of instinct, perhaps out of something deeper, she bowed. Not in fear, not in surrender, but in recognition. A gesture of grace from a girl who had been stripped of everything except the will to still choose how she met the world. Harlan's hand rose. For a moment the crowd held its breath, unsure what he'd do. But all he did was lay his palm gently against her, shoulder steady, solid, warm. Not claiming her, not lifting her, just letting her know she didn't have to stand alone. Then he nodded. Once. The same nod as before. And for the first time in days, Aiko's eyes filled with tear, not from pain, but from something far more dangerous. Hope. The sun had begun to dip behind the ridge when Harlan untied his horse from the rail. He moved slow, deliberate, without a glance at the murmuring crowd still gathered like crows around the gallows they never questioned. With the same steady hand that placed the gold on the crate, he reached up and helped the girl Aiko, down from the platform. Her legs wobbled beneath her, but she didn't fall. His hand never left her arm. No one tried to stop them. Victor Kane didn't speak. He simply watched, jaw tight, eyes narrowed, as Harlan lifted Aiko onto the saddle, with the kind of care reserved for something that might break her already had. Then Harlan swung up behind her, the horse shifting beneath their combined weight. A small grunt from the animal, and they turned toward the trail that wound west, dust curling up around the hooves like smoke. The town stayed silent behind them. No one cheered, no one jeered. The girl had been bought, but not in the way anyone expected. And something about that unsettled them more than the violence they'd anticipated. The ride was long, and neither spoke. But words weren't needed. Aiko sat tense at first, shoulders drawn in, her breath shallow. She kept waiting for him to speak, to lay out rules, demands, conditions. When none came, she risked glancing back once. He wasn't looking at her. He was scanning the horizon, jaw set, eyes forward. But his hand remained light on the reins and firm behind her back, steadying her each time the trail grew uneven. By the time the sun sank into the earth and twilight kissed the hills, Aiko no longer flinched when the horse jolted. She let herself lean back, just slightly, just enough to rest. She didn't know where they were going. But for the first time in days, she didn't feel like she was riding toward worse. The ranch appeared like a memory, modest but well kept, nestled between two sloping hills. A small corral sat off to one side, a garden on the other. A single lantern glowed in the window of the main house. Harlan dismounted, then offered her a hand. She hesitated only a second before taking it. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and old coffee. There were no locks, no cages. Just worn wood floors, a fire already kindled in the hearth, and the soft creak of a rocking chair that hadn't moved in years. He pointed to the small room down the hall and left her alone. Aiko stood in the doorway, unsure of what to do with the stillness. On the bed was a folded quilt. On the nightstand, a small dish of water and a wrapped biscuit. Her stomach growled before she could stop it. She ate slowly, savoring each bite like it might vanish. Later, she found a spool of thread tucked in the drawer. Her kimono ripped and dirtied still clung to her like memory, and she began to sew. Every stitch was a reclamation. Before sleeping, she reached for a piece of charcoal from the fireplace and walked to the far wall. Her fingers moved in practiced strokes, her father's teachings flowing through her fingertips. And there, on the smooth plank beside the window, she wrote, Aizi. Her name. Aiko. Child of love. And for the first time in her life on this soil, that name belonged to her again. The fire crackled softly in the stone hearth, casting long flickers of light across the wooden walls of the cabin. Harlan stood before it, motionless, a chipped tin cup of untouched coffee cooling in his hand. His eyes weren't on the flames, they were fixed on the photograph nailed into the mantel. The picture had faded some, edges curled, but the faces remained sharp in his mind. A woman with a half smile, her black hair pulled into a loose bun, stood holding a small girl with a sun hat too big for her head. The child's grin was crooked like her mother's, but her eyes were wide, filled with that soft, wild light children get when the world still seems safe. It had been 5 years since they'd been buried. The railroad men had come through with their stakes and surveys, laying track across sacred ground like it was nothing but dirt and profit. Harlan hadn't known they were trespassing until it was too late. His wife had stood in the way, calm, firm, fearless. His daughter had held her hand. One bullet killed them both. And nothing, not law, not apologies, not vengeance, had brought peace. So Harlan didn't seek revenge. He just walked away, built fences where no one would follow, learned to live quiet, learned to disappear. But some mensome ghosts don't let the past stay buried. As the fire dimmed to coals, Harlan turned from the photo, slowly setting the cup down on the windowsill. Outside, the wind had stilled. The land slept, blanketed in moonlight. But something in him twitched, that old feeling, that edge. Something was coming, and he wasn't wrong. They rode in just before dawn, 3 men on horses black as night, their saddles slick with oil and malice. No words, no greetings, just the creak of leather and the whisper of iron sliding from scabbards. They circled the ranch slow, like vultures measuring meat. Inside, Aiko slept, curled beneath the quilt with her repaired kimono folded neatly beside her. She didn't hear the first knock, didn't hear the second. But Harlan did. He stepped to the door, pulled his coat from the hook, and quietly holstered the Colt that hadn't left his side in years. The third knock was louder. Harlan opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The man in front, wide-shouldered, dead-eyed, grinned like this was all just business. "Boss says the girl's not yours," he said. "Says you bought something that don't belong to you." Harlan said nothing. The man tilted his head. "So this is how it's gonna go, is it?" Again, nothing. The man's grin faltered. "Last chance, Gage. Step aside." Harlan blinked slowly, like someone bored with conversation. Then he took one step forward. It happened fast. The first shot rang out before the others could even draw. One man dropped, screaming. A bullet lodged deep in his thigh. The second charged, but Harlan moved like a machine forged in grief, quick, precise, merciless. A blow to the temple, a twist of the wrist. A gun dropped to the dirt. The third man froze. Harlan pointed his revolver between the man's eyes. "Go," he said. His voice was low, rasped from disuse, but it landed like thunder. The man didn't argue. He turned his horse and fled into the rising light, dust trailing behind him like smoke from a funeral pyre. Harlan stood still, breath heavy in the cold air, until the hoofbeats vanished. Then he holstered the Colt and turned toward the door. Because the past didn't sleep. And now it had found him again. Morning came with golden light spilling across the hills, gentle and slow, as if the land itself had decided to take a breath. Birds flitted in the distance, their songs soft and uncertain, not quite ready to sing full-throated. Inside the cabin, the air was still heavy with the scent of gunpowder and the quiet aftermath of violence. Aiko sat at the small wooden table, her hands wrapped around a chipped porcelain cup of warm tea. Her hair was freshly combed, tied back with a piece of cotton string she'd found tucked in a drawer. She wore her repaired kimono, now patched, faded, but whole again. Her eyes followed Harlan as he moved through the room, checking the windows, setting down supplies. He didn't speak. He never did. But she'd seen it last night. What he was capable of, the precision, the fury behind his calm. He had killed without hesitation, but not for pleasure. She had seen killers before, the kind who smiled when others begged. Harlan hadn't smiled. His face had stayed cold and focused, as if the act was just another grim part of breathing. Still, she needed to ask. She rose carefully, stepping toward him. He was crouched by the fireplace, loading wood into the embers. "Why?" she asked softly. Her voice was thick with her accent, each syllable shaped carefully. "Why? Help me." Harlan didn't look up. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, without a word, he reached behind a wooden beam and pulled out a small, worn book wrapped in linen. He stood, walked over, and placed it in her hands just gently enough that she didn't feel the weight until it was there. The cover was cracked, the edges soft with time. Her fingers brushed over the faint gold print. Japanese, English phrases for travelers and friends. Inside, the pages had been annotated in 2 hands, zone sharp and angular, the other soft and flowing. Tiny translations, grammar corrections, little drawings in the margins. Aiko's heart stuttered. She flipped through slowly, page by page, passing sections titled Food, Weather, Emotions, until she reached a section near the middle. There, a page had been marked with a frayed strip of cloth. The word at the top of the page was circled 3 times. Home. Beside it, in fading ink, someone had written the kanji, ja. Below that, in much neater handwriting, someone had added the hiragana for pronunciation, i.e. And next to it, almost hidden in the fold of the spine, another note. Where hearts stay, even when people go. Aiko's fingers trembled. She looked up at him, and for the first time, saw past the silence. He wasn't saving her. He had looked at her on that platform, seen her pain, her fear, and something inside him had sparked. Not pity, not duty. Recognition. Some part of him had seen her as more than a girl in need. She had reminded him of something lost. Someone loved. A piece of himself he'd buried with 2 wooden crosses and a silence so heavy, it nearly consumed him. Aiko pressed the book to her chest. And without speaking another word, she bowed, not low, not submissive, but deep enough to say, I see you, too. The wind howled through the hills like it knew what was coming. Dust swirled down the trail as 6 riders thundered into the canyon that cradled Harlan's ranch. They moved in a tight formation, rifles across saddles, pistols at their hips, eyes scanning every window and ridge. At their head rode Victor Kane, dressed in a charcoal duster that caught the morning light like polished coal. His gold tooth glinted when he grinned, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. He reined in his stallion just past the gate, his men fanning out behind him like wolves scenting blood. The house stood quiet. No movement, no smoke, no sign of fear. Victor spat into the dirt and spoke like a man giving sermon to a dying town. Harlan Gage, he called out, voice thick with contempt. I know you're in there, and I know you think what you did buying what wasn't yours was noble. He leaned forward in the saddle, eyes burning toward the cabin. But let's be clear, he said, louder now. That girl ain't worth the silver you threw down. Hell, she ain't worth the dirt under her feet. From the doorway, Harlan stepped out. No rifle, no speech. Just him. His coat flapped in the rising wind. The Colt at his hip hadn't left its holster, but the air shifted the moment he appeared. A silence spread, the kind that always comes before gunfire. Victor smirked. Still not much of a talker, are ya? He dismounted, handed his reins to a nearby rider, and walked forward 5 paces. Tell you what, I'll make this simple. You hand over the girl, and I let you live. Maybe even patch up that busted shoulder you're gonna have after I shoot you anyway. Harlan didn't blink, didn't flinch. He stepped forward in Steadin's slow stride that put him directly between the cabin and the line of rifles. Victor chuckled and drew. But Harlan drew faster. The Colt roared like a cannon. One rider fell, throat gone. Another caught a bullet in the gut and crumpled over his horse's neck. The third managed to raise his rifle before a round split the stalk in half and drove him backward into the dust. Gunfire erupted, wild and vicious. The ranch became a battlefield. Harlan spun, fired, pivoted, each shot precise, economical, devastating, but not perfect. A sharp crack rang out and a bullet tore into his left shoulder, spinning him back against the corral post. He grunted but didn't fall. Blood soaked his sleeve, but his hand stayed steady. By the time the smoke thinned, 5 men lay dead or dying. Only Victor Kane remained, his pistol raised, his face twisted with fury. And then the door opened. Aiko stepped out. Her face was pale, but her hands didn't shake. From within her kimono, she pulled a sheathed dagger, short, curved, wrapped in black cloth. A gift from her father. One he told her to use only when she had nothing left to lose. Victor saw her and laughed. You gonna cry me to death, girl? But he never saw her move. She was faster than anyone expected. Aiko closed the distance in 3 quiet steps, her eyes locked on his. She pressed the blade against his throat, just beneath the line of his jaw, hard enough to draw a bead of blood. Victor froze, His pistol wavered. Harlan, still bleeding, raised his Colt one final time. His voice rasped like gravel across stone. "Drop it." Victor Kane hesitated. Then his pistol hit the ground. And for the first time, the girl they'd all tried to buy stood above her price sharp, still and unbreakable. Victor Kane dropped to his knees in the dust, his breath ragged, the dagger still at his throat. Blood beaded where the blade had kissed him small, but real. His pistol lay abandoned in the dirt, forgotten. The color had drained from his face. Gone was the man who barked orders and bought souls with silver. What remained was nothing more than a cornered animal, eyes wide, voice trembling. "Please," he gasped, one hand lifted in surrender. "Two can pay. Double what you spent, triple. Just don't let her." Aiko stood over him, the dagger steady in her grip. Her expression was unreadable. She looked down at him like someone trying to remember how she had ever been afraid of a man like this. Kane's sweat mixed with the dust on his face, streaking his cheeks like war paint on the losing side. "You don't have to do this," he stammered. "You're not like me. You don't kill, you." His voice choked off when Harlan stepped closer. He didn't say a word, just moved beside Aiko and gently placed a hand over hers, lowering the blade. She looked at him, confused, breathless, the fire still in her chest, but his eyes were calm, not soft, not forgiving, just firm, resolute. He shook his head once. "Not this way." And something in her finally let go. The blade dropped to her side. Her shoulders rose with a trembling breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Victor collapsed forward with a pathetic sob. By midday, he was shackled in the back of the sheriff's wagon, his wrists raw, his lips split from the one punch Harlan allowed himself before handing over the evidence ledgers, letters, names. Proof enough to burn the whole trafficking ring to the ground. The sheriff, for once, didn't ask questions. He just nodded grimly and rode hard for the capital. But the real reckoning came the next morning in the town court. Red Bluff had never seen its pews so full. Miners, traders, even ranchers who hadn't stepped into town in months crowded into the creaking hall, whispering beneath their breath. They had come to see if it was true, if the silent rancher really had brought down Victor Kane, and if the girl they'd once mocked was still his shadow. She wasn't. Aiko walked into the courthouse in a freshly washed kimono, mended completely, tied at the waist with a simple braided sash. Her hair was clean, her posture straight, no ropes on her wrists. No shame on her face. She stepped up to the witness stand with the same calm she had shown when facing a pistoland this time. She wasn't silent. When the judge asked her name, she didn't hesitate. She raised her chin, let her voice fill the room, and said clearly, "My name is Aiko, Aiza, daughter of Ichiro Sato. I was born in Kyoto, and I am not for sale." A hush fell so thick it made the old clock on the wall seem loud. In the back of the courtroom, leaning against the wall with dust still on his boots and a fresh bandage on his shoulder, Harlan Gage tipped his hat low across his eyes. Not to hide, but to honor her. And in that silent gesture, she bowed not to him, not to the court, but to the girl she had once been, and to the one who would never return. She didn't need saving anymore. She had found herself. The seasons had shifted quietly, as they often did in the hill summer, fading into a mild autumn, with the scent of hay and wood smoke carried on the wind. The land, once dry and unforgiving, had softened under patient hands. Furrows were neater now. The garden rose straight and generous. And in the quietest hours of morning, before the sun cleared the ridge, the sound of children's laughter across Harlan Gage's ranch. Aiko moved barefoot across the soil, sleeves rolled up, her hands deep in the earth as she pulled late carrots from the garden bed. A straw hat shaded her face, and she hummed a soft Tunia folk song her mother used to sing during harvest back in Kyoto. She wasn't sure anyone else knew the melody, but the land seemed to understand it all the same. The ranch had changed, just as she had. 3 times a week, children from the town would ride or walk the long trail to the ranch. Boys with scuffed knees, girls with ink-stained fingers. They came not just to visit, but to learn. Aiko would spread out scrolls and brushes on the porch and teach them how to shape letters elegant, careful kanji on rice paper, each stroke a prayer for clarity. They listened to her stories too. Of temples and foxes, of ghosts who taught lessons, and dragons who guarded waterfalls. She told them not to be afraid of silence, that sometimes it spoke the loudest truths. The townsfolk, once curious and wary, had grown used to her presence. Some nodded when they passed her at the market. Others sent their children with jars of ink or old books for her lessons. No one called her girl anymore. They called her Miss Aiko, and they meant it. Inside the barn, in the space near the tack wall, Harlan was busy with his morning ritual. He stood before a weathered plank that now bore a dozen kanji carved into the grain, each carefully chiseled with a steady hand. Words like hope, peace, strength, and home lived there foreign to many, but sacred in their presence. Today, he added a new one. He pressed the carving blade into the wood and etched slowly, thoughtfully, until the final stroke was done. Honor, Mingyu. He stepped back, wiped his blade, and nodded once, the way he always did. He didn't need applause. The word was its own monument. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and the air cooled, Aiko stood in the hallway of the cabin holding her old kimono in her hands. It was clean now, fully repaired. She had thought, once, she would burn it, that it carried only pain. But she had come to understand that it wasn't the kimono that hurt. It was what had been stolen while she wore it. She hung it beside the dress that had belonged to Harlan's daughter, a small blue cotton dress with tiny buttons shaped like flowers. The two garments swayed gently in the quiet draft, side by side, two lives, two stories, bound by loss but no longer ruled by it. Harlan watched from the far end of the hall. He didn't speak. He just removed his hat and held it to his chest. That night, as the stars came out and the world hushed to stillness, Aiko sat on the porch steps, brush in hand, writing letters by lantern light. Her name, the children's names, words for tomorrow. And inside that home built on silence, loss, and soil, a girl once bought for $1 had become something no one could price. She had become the living heart of a man who thought he had nothing left to feel.